Well, okay, so if anybody out there isn't familiar with myself or my work at this point, I've run a school garden program here in the Bow Valley, mostly Canmore, but
Okay.
also a little bit out in Exshaw for the past 8 years. And
Oh,
so when I say I'm a student in this, I want everybody to understand that when I started, I had no or at least very little gardening experience of my own. And I definitely went through the school of hard knocks, but um, we've been able to produce like a nice amount of food here in the Bow Valley. And the little example I gave in the introduction, if you didn't get a chance to see it, was this past year on less than a third of an acre, we grew uh, 1,500 kilos of food. And that's in the Canadian Rockies in very cool, short growing seasons. So it's not about, you don't have to be an expert in plants in order to have success because they really just want to grow. And if we have that basic understanding of them, then they'll do what they already want to do.
yeah.
Sound good? All right, I'm gonna flip this. So I want to introduce a concept that was I don't know, invented but articulated by James H. Wandersee and Elizabeth Crystal, and it's called plant blindness. And that might sound weird because you're like, well, I can see plants. There's no problem there. But this is an actual clinical term, and it is very, very prevalent in our modern world. And it refers to the inability to see or notice plants in one's own environment. So if you are sitting there right now, I want you to take a couple seconds and think to yourself, how many plant species have you walked by today that you could actually name? And so we tend not to appreciate the flora around us, at least not to the same degree as animals. I mean, like elk and deer and eagles, those really pop out in our mind. When we see those, we instantly identify those. Whereas as we walk past plants around the neighborhood, we tend not to notice them so much. And so that is one of the biggest reasons I think why we need to work on our gardening skills. The more we can see and identify plants and know all the names of all their parts and what they do, that is going to determine how good of gardeners we are. And so, yeah, so I just want part of the point of this course, I guess the biggest point of this course is to help people become better gardeners. But in order to do that, I want to cure ourselves, our community of our plant blindness as best as we can. And not only are we going to become better gardeners, but I think you'll find that um, our the widespread environmental degradation that we see, we can, to the extent that we cure ourselves of our plant blindness as a community and a global community, I think a lot of those problems are solved. Like that's the root cause of the problems is our inability to really see and appreciate plants at a deeper level. We can talk about more of that later if you guys want. I won't drone on about it. But I do want to point out the quote at the bottom of the screen that says, all of the world's problems can be solved in a garden. That might seem a little bit extreme. It definitely felt like a lot of hyperbole the first time I saw that quote or I heard that quote. But the more I've come to know and appreciate the plant kingdom, the more it rings true for me. So by the end of the class, we're not going to debate that right now, but by the end of the class, maybe we can see what people think about that. And I'm trying to flip the screen. Oh, I jumped. Okay. So the thing about plant sciences and starting to become more proficient in them is that they are really complex in a way. And there's this quote from Catherine Clyer, who teaches one of the great courses on botany. It's called the Great Courses, if you look that up. And she says that botany isn't rocket science, it's more complex. And so what she means by that is that the physics and the math involved in rocket science is really, really complicated, but it stays the same all the time. And so it's a lot more predictable than botany. Okay, so botany is for anarchists because it's really, really hard to find rules within botany. There's always going to be these rebel plants that do not fit in the proper category. And so this is just kind of showing, you'll see what I mean, that this is, it creates some complexity when we talk about plants. And I'm going to admit right off the bat that during the first couple lessons, there's going to be some things I say about plants that aren't even true. Which might seem weird. This is like the second slide of the presentation, and I'm already going to tell you that I'm kind of lying to you. But the reason for that is that we're going to start in the most general sense of plant sciences, and then we're going to get more specific, and we'll deal with those. There's just so much diversity in the plant world. There are over 300,000 different kinds of plant species that exist. And so it's yeah, just trying to find a rule to explain plants is really hard. But once we get to like the botanical language, we'll sort through that, and you'll see what I mean. And then also, to be fair, I'm talking about all this complexity, but there are patterns. We'll start to see that although rules are hard to find, the patterns start to emerge, and we're not going to be dealing with all 300,000 species. Really, the garden crops that we'll be talking about eventually gets whittled down to 100 or a couple hundred. So it'll get easier and easier. And then again, remember that plants want to grow, and that we just need to know that basic foundation about how they work, and we can put that into practice. And if we do experience failure in our garden, which is inevitable, you'll at least have the language and the direction to gain some feedback and learn the lessons from those failures, so that the next time you're in the garden, you can correct those.
Hello.
Sorry?
Does someone have a question? Maybe just an accidental unmute.
And so, yes, the plant sciences are complex, and the world life is complex, but we use scientific models as tools to help us understand the world. Okay, and what we got to understand is that our scientific models, they aren't perfect, but quite honestly, they don't have to be perfect as long as they help us understand things. So, for example, we go through our lives with this concept of what an atom is, with its electrons that orbit it, or we go through our lives with this concept of DNA. but nobody's ever actually seen either of those things. They're just scientific models that help us understand the behavior of what's going on in our physical reality. And so they don't have to be perfect as long as they help us understand something that's really complex. And so with that in mind, I'm going to use a lot of kind of crude metaphors and analogies that will hopefully help people understand what plants are doing and the way that they behave. And so I am fully admitting right off the top that I know they're not perfect, but they're just little glimpses into, they're a jumping off point from things that we already know and are familiar with. And so that should help relate these complex ideas that we're trying to wrap our minds around. And then as you see these analogies, if you think of one yourself that you think might be helpful, or you think I might have missed one, I want to encourage people to share them. And so the first analogy I like to use when teaching about plants and talking about the complexity of it all is because there are so many factors that affect our garden, they're in a dynamic relationship with each other, but we can't teach a lesson all at once to help people understand all at once. We have to kind of break them up into compartmentalized little lessons. And so think about these first lessons in these classes as just strings all by themselves. Okay, so that's why I got these strings up here. And so I'm going to talk about them separate from each other first. But as we move along in the classes, we'll start to see how these seemingly separate lessons and different parts of the plants, how they are really woven together into a very beautiful pattern that's dynamic and always changing. And so that's what I like to think about as the weave. So it might seem a little bit dry off the top, hopefully not too dry, but it does get more and more interesting as we go. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll take your silence as tacit approval. And I also want to take one more slide to talk about how this might feel in the class. This is obviously not an ideal scenario to be teaching about gardening. If we were in the ideal place, we'd be in the garden right now, or you know, we'd be working with plants ourselves. But obviously COVID makes things a little bit more difficult for everybody. So we're past that point of worrying about what's perfect. I want you to think about these classes as I can only really point you in the right direction. And you need to go out and hopefully remember the tips from these classes. And you need to go out into the garden or into the forest, and you need to make those observations for yourself. And so from the perspective of indigenous wisdom that I learned in this book here, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, in indigenous wisdom, they say that the plants are the real elders and they're the real teachers. And when I read that, that just made so much sense to me, because I've read a whole lot of books about plants, and I can't tell you how many times I've finished a paragraph, or I've finished a chapter, and to be honest, like in my mind, I'm just like, I think I get it. Like I'm pretty sure I get what they were talking about. And then I'm going to the garden and something will happen like spontaneously. I'll just see something about the way that a plant is behaving. And that's when I really get that aha moment that clicks in my mind. And so I'm predicting that even if we go through this whole class and you still kind of feel kind of fuzzy on the ideas, it's the plants, it's going out and making those observations that are going to make them really, really actualized experiences for you. And you'll really get what I'm saying. So a little bit of patience. I know we live in a world of instant gratification, but nature is different. It moves at its own pace. So let's get into some plant structures and functions. So this is probably the most obvious thing of the entire presentation. We're going to start with roots. And one of the functions that roots plays for plants is that it's kind of like an anchor, right? It holds it in the soil. I guess you could also kind of think about it as like the foundation for a building. It holds all that above ground weight. So the roots are the anchor, and then everything above the soil is like the shoots. You'll hear me saying, and you'll hear other gardeners saying that a lot. The roots and the shoots. And I have this picture here of a giant redwood sequoia in California. This is General Sherman. It is the tallest tree, at least currently. It is, you could line up 3 blue whales nose to tail, and those still wouldn't be as tall as this tree. And so I put this here just for you to consider how much those roots are anchoring all that stress, all that weight that plant is putting on those roots and holding it in place. Pretty obvious. Don't have to go into that much, I don't think. The next one is that the roots play the function of absorbing water and nutrients. And so we have a picture here of a sponge, because everybody knows a sponge absorbs water. And then we have a picture of the root system of a mangrove tree. And again, pretty obvious. The nutrients, a lot of the nutrients that a plant will take up from its root system are dissolved in the water already. So yeah, I don't know if I have to, I guess I also want to try to save a lot of the gardening lessons for the later classes, but I will sprinkle in some. And I guess one of the big mistakes that I see new gardeners make is when their plant seedlings are at a very young age, to underwater their seeds when they're germinating or when they've just germinated. You have to understand that the surface area of their roots aren't deep down into the soil, so they're much more vulnerable to drying out. So that would be an obvious kind of pointer right off the bat. And so the next function that the roots serve, there's going to be lots of different functions for each one of these structures, because nature is always multifunctional. And this one isn't as obvious to people, I've found. The roots function as an energy storage system. So the examples here are carrots and potatoes, which we eat. Those are our vegetable root crops. And the reason why we eat them is because they are quite rich in starchy sugars. And so that's a cultivated variety that humans have bred over the years. And this is a very exaggerated example. But when a plant is making energy in its leaves with photosynthesis, all those sugars, it's a very important strategy for them to sequester a lot of that energy down into the root system. If they get injured somehow, then this is like a backup plan so that they don't die. If they get injured to the root system, they have extra energy. They can send up new shoots above the soil and start making energy again. And we're also going to see how this plays out in growth strategies for trees and shrubs. Spoiler alert, it has something to do with if you like maple syrup. syrup, something to do with that. But I'll say here that I think understanding the roots as an energy storage system is important because it has implications for managing weedy plant species in the garden. I've heard people say that there's no point of pulling a weed if you don't get the whole root system. And I know why people say that, but it's not necessarily true. I mean, if you're doing some weeding and you pull a whole plant up with root system and all, then that's amazing, but that's a lot of grunt work. I've found that because I understand the energy storage function of a root, is that if I come across a well-established weedy species in the garden and I pull on it and I only get the shoots, I only get the stems and the leaves, and the root is still in the ground, then you're right. Next week I'll come back and it has grown back and it feels very demoralizing and it feels like there's no point of weeding unless you get the whole root. But if you understand that you pulled the stems and the leaves and it had to use extra energy stored in its roots to produce a whole new shoot, and it hasn't had much of an ability over this past week to produce more energy. So if I pull on that shoot system again, then I've weakened it again, and it's going to have to take more of its energy out of its root system in order to produce another shoot again. So if I keep being stubborn like that, if by the third week I come back to that same plant, I'll bet, actually I don't have to bet, I know from experience that it'll probably have sent up another shoot system with leaves, but at this point that shoot system is starting to show stress. Its leaves won't be as broad and as lustrous. Lustrous, is that the right word? Yeah, it just won't look as healthy. And so that third time I pull on it, chances are kind of like 50-50 that the whole root system will come out. And if it doesn't, then the next week I come back and it'll look really unhealthy. It'll look really unstressed, and that time I'll get it out. And so this is just putting this knowledge into practice. And I get it. It's kind of like grunt work, but that's just proof of the energy storage capacity of roots. That makes sense? All right. So this next one doesn't apply to every plant. It applies to expansive plants whose have a propagation strategy to expand vertically through the soil, through what are often called rhizomes. And so that's why I have these feet walking across the top, is that we think about plants as not being able to move, but some plants can actually walk through the soil by basically expanding through their root system. And that's why I'm holding up that in the picture. There's a picture of me at the high school there from this past summer, and I have a very sad face. You can see my bottom lip protruding quite aggressively there, and I'm holding up quackgrass. And so if somebody had told me about this feature of quackgrass and yarrow when I started that high school garden, it would have saved me hours and hours of just like brutal, soul-crushing, bent-over work because I did not fully appreciate this when I started. And so when I prepped those beds originally, that quackgrass, I didn't get rid of all of it, and it reestablished in my walkways. And then every season, it just kept on growing into the beds and growing into the beds and growing into the beds. And no matter how much I took it out of the beds, it didn't really matter because it was photosynthesizing in my walkways and just sending these expansive rhizome shoots into the garden beds. So if you are considering building a new garden in your lawn and you dig into the soil and you find a root system that looks like this, these long strings with those shoots coming off the side, like here, then I highly recommend putting in. They're called rhizome blockers. I'll share a picture of these rhizome barriers in a later class in order for you to better understand. But this is just a very important thing if you're starting a garden, or if you've noticed you have a garden and you keep on dealing with the same issue. You're going to have to just create you're going to have to isolate it with a barrier somehow, or you're going to have to smother it with some sheet mulch. And I'll talk more about the sheet mulch. And so this doesn't totally pertain to our gardening, but this is just another example, an extreme example of this expansive ability of some plant species. This is called pando, and it is the largest tree. This is basically the largest organism on Earth, and it's quite old too. So these quaking aspens are all the same plant. They've just expanded through their root system, and they've taken over this entire grove. And it's estimated that this one plant, because it's expanded horizontally through the soil and just sent up new shoots, it's estimated that it weighs 6 million kilos. Not too shabby. All right, so now we'll be getting into some stuff that that isn't so obvious to your novice gardeners. And so another really important function of plants is to act as the symbiotic. It's like the interface where this amazing symbiotic interaction happens with soil microbes. A plant, I haven't got to leaves yet, but spoiler alert, the leaves of the plants are where they're making sugars from sunlight energy, carbon dioxide, and water. And they use those sugars for their own metabolic functions in order to grow and to do all sorts of things. But they actually take a significant amount of those sugars and they push them down into the root systems, and they give them off in what the technical term is called exudates. So this middle top photo here is an actual picture of a root leaking exudates out into, I mean, if it was a soil medium, it would be going in, that looks like it's in a petri dish though. And so they're just giving away free energy into the root system. And they do this because, as we'll see in later classes, it increases the nutrient availability around their root system. This root system is called the Rhizosphere. And by feeding their friends the soil food web down in their root system, it actually helps protect them from pest and disease. So it benefits the plants a lot to give away these free sugars. And as an example, in the top right corner of this picture here, this is a picture of a parasitic nematode. Hey, Luke, can you see my cursor? Yep. Yeah. So that's, yeah, that's the nematode there. This down here, that looks like the floor, that's actually a root hair. So this is like very highly magnified. That's 20 micrometers. So that is 21 millionths of a meter that we're seeing right there. And then this is the hyphae of a fungal partner And so that is a little piece of mushroom, the body of a mushroom. And so this mushroom, well, the fungal hyphae is literally attached to the root system of this tomato plant. And the nematode is one of the enemies of that tomato plant. But the mushroom hyphae right here, it actually was emitting like this signal out into the soil medium, pretending to be a stressed plant. And so that attracted the parasitic nematode to come in thinking it was going to get an easy lunch. And you can see right here how this hyphae has actually latched on. And if the picture, you know, if this was a video, within minutes, you would see that this strand of fungi would actually be basically like mining out the nutrients from this parasitic nematode and feeding it to the tomato root. So pretty cool nanotechnology almost, if you will. And just one example of the way that the plants are trading these free sugars to these soil microbes, and the soil microbes are doing really valuable jobs for the plants in return. And the other thing I'll mention right here is that the plants seem to be in control of this process. They can exude, they can give away different kinds of exudates based on what they need most, which is really, really interesting. There's going to be a lot of these slides that, you know, start to make us think about what kind of intelligence plants have. It's not really in the scope of these gardening lessons, but to kind of debate that, I mean, we can if we want, but is really impressive in my mind. The more I've studied plants and seen all these examples of really, really intelligent behavior.
Hey, Christian, Marcy has a question for you. Marcy, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. Christian, before you were talking about the aspens, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if those are the same aspens that we have here in town.
It could be. There's all sorts of different species of aspens. That was I can go back. That was the specific quaking aspen. So yeah, I've seen trees that look like that. They do really well in early succession, like disturbed environments. So that's where you would see them. I'll admit, Marcy, that my tree identification skills are I'm still working on them. So I couldn't say if it's the exact same kind of species. But if it's not the exact same, they're very, very similar in a lot of ways.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would also point out I have Latin botanical names underneath all of these. I'll talk more about them when we get to the botanical language class next week. But you can see by the Latin name here, Populus tremuloides, it's telling us some important information. It's telling us it's related to other poplar species. And then they're called quaking aspens. And then you can see tremuloides. They're considered like they're trembling because the way they hold their leaves, they kind of shake back and forth, which, you know, so that's included in their name. But a cool feature, other than the fact that they basically clone themselves, is this trembling kind of behavior. And they have an extra advantage where they can photosynthesize with both sides of their leaves. And that's that tremblingness of the way that they hold their leaves. I don't know, fun fact. Was that fun?
That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any more questions before I go ahead? Okay, I'm going to go ahead. So another really, really interesting feature of roots that has been for way too long underappreciated, but is really starting to become more prevalent is their ability to communicate with each other and cooperate with each other. So I was talking about how in the last slide, how plants will become partners with soil microbes, and one of those really, really important soil microbes, actually I'll go back, is it's called Mycorrhizae. And so it's a kind of fungi that will actually attach itself to the root system, and they get these free sugars for the plants. And not only do they do really cool things like protect them from parasitic nematodes, but they connect many, many species of different trees in a grove or in the forest. And there's really, really interesting research coming out these days showing how they talk to each other. Obviously, they don't have mouths, but through chemical signaling through their roots and through these fungal partners, and then to their neighbors around them. And so I would go off for the rest of the class if I could talking about this, but we got to move along. So I want to really recommend that people look up the Dr. Suzanne Simard from University of British Columbia has done a lot of this pioneering work. I did attach like a little video down here, which we don't have time, but so that's a TED Talk about how trees talk to each other. And then the other example that I'll just touch on briefly here is from a book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Volobin. And in his book, he talks about, he's a forest manager in the Aachen forest in Germany. And he was strolling through the forest making observations, and he came upon this weird looking rock, and it was just such an odd shape that he kind of dug around, and he pushed the moss back and he pushed the soil away, and he found that it was actually the stump of an old ancient tree. And he took his little knife out, and because it felt soft, and he kind of excavated around, and he found that there was living tissue on this stump of the tree, but the tree had been covered. He estimated that the tree had been dead for, maybe 100 years now. Like it had been felled by some lumber forestry person very long time ago. But he found there was living tissue, and so the research that he did led him to believe that stump of the tree was being kept alive by its neighboring trees. They were sending that stump extra sugar in order to keep it alive and sharing nutrients. And we could go way off into the deep end about how cool this behavior is, but I'll just leave that at that and let you folks do your own research on that.
Can I ask a quick question on this topic, Christian?
Yeah, Molly.
I know that like that research was done in like old growth forests where the trees have like lived together for a long time, but what do you think about plant communication in vegetable gardens where the plants are all like newly established? Do you think that same communication still happens?
I don't know if the communication happens. I don't know if there's enough time in an annual vegetable garden, but it is estimated that around, the percentage wise, I think like 90, like almost all 9 out of 10 flowering plants, which is, we work a lot with flowering plants in the garden. A very, very high percentage of them make these fungal associations. So if they're not, talking to each other, then they're still they're still trading these extra sugars in order to gain those benefits and so forth. But the more we work with perennial plants, then the more I think the research has seen evidence of this. And I also want to point out that every time I've read about something about this, the field is just so young. It's a burgeoning kind of a field of study, and everybody admits that there's so much more left, more research to be done before we can say really solidly what's going on and all the implications of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, come on now. Did that screen share? Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, we're back on.
Awesome.
Maybe we're not. Okay, and then same along the same lines. So I have a picture of the guy from Toy Story, the prospector. So roots, you could say that roots act like prospectors or search parties. They show this behavior where they're going out into the soil and they're not just spreading randomly. They seem to be the way they behave, like they if they find a patch of fertile soil, then they really kind of grow around that. So they're kind of like prospectors. I was going to put a picture of like a search party, but that would seem kind of grisly. I want to keep it on the positive note. And then there's also like this research done by Monica Gagliano on bioacoustics. If you Google Monica Gagliano, or if you read this book, you'll see that this little experiment she set up was really interesting. She took basically a teed off or a Y PVC, and she planted peas in the top of it. And then she played the sound of running water on one side and then just kind of like white noise on the other. And she found from a statistically significant point of view, the roots were growing towards the sound of water. And so obviously plants don't have ears, but they do. I mean, the hearing is just vibration, and so they do seem to show the ability to sense those vibrations. And obviously water is an important thing for plants. And so another example of interesting research that shows plant intelligence. And yeah, obviously it's still kind of speculative. We need, in order to understand and objectively understand it, then we need a lot more replicated studies, but interesting nonetheless. So we're going to move on to stems next, unless anybody has any questions about roots. Does any of those slides surprise anybody? Nope. All right.
Definitely, yes.
All right. Thanks, Molly.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Mom. All right. Let's move on to stems. I also, before I move on to stems, I'll just say that for me to just say roots and just kind of group that in a broad sense like that, we will, when we get to botanical language and classification, we're going to talk about the different root architectures that exist. So again, we're just starting in a simple way, but we'll move forward and get more specific as we go. So now we're going to talk about stems, and this one's pretty easy. The stems, the main function of stems is the physical support of leaves. So plants need to compete with each other for light, and so the stems allow them to grow tall and to compete with each other so that they can get as much of that light as possible. The next one is that the stems provide housing for what we call vascular tissue. And so if it helps you to think about the stems as being housing for a plumbing system, then you can do so, if that's helpful. And then we have here a couple cross sections. This one in the bottom left is like an herbaceous annual kind of cross section, and you can see there's the pith in the middle, which is the support, which I already talked about. And then there's this ring that goes around towards the outside, and that's the plumbing system, which is the xylem is taking up the water with the nutrients, and the phloem is what's moving around the sugary, the sap that they need. So when we talk about the root exudates, then the phloem is what's taking that sugary sap that they've created down to the root system, and it's taking the sugary energy down to the root system so that it can store it in case of an emergency, like a gardener coming and pulling them out of the ground. And then we can also see here a cross section of a woody perennial. And again, towards the outside, we see that the phloem and the xylem is that vascular tissue that's basically the plumbing system for the plant. I have a little picture here of a tiny little photovoltaic cell, and it's just a small voltaic cell because obviously a stem doesn't have as much surface area as the leaves, but they still have some surface area, and if it's green, then it's producing a little bit of energy. So they do have a little bit of ability to do that. And they also, again, when we were talking about the root system as being a storage system for energy, I had the car battery there, but the stem can do it as well, but not to the same extent. So it's a picture of AAA batteries. They can hold a little bit of energy, and they'll use that energy again if there's an injury that occurs. And now we got a picture of a starfish who are known for their ability to regenerate. And so that is representative of the stem has this meristem potential, this ability to regenerate and recover from injury. We're going to talk a lot more about meristem and this ability to regenerate when we get to later class, when we're going to talk about cloning, taking stem cuttings. But for now, I'm just going to mention it. We're just building a foundation so that later we're all on the same page. And was it going to play for me? And so tendrils are very specialized modified stem tissues, and they are present in vining species. And so you can see from this video, this tendril on, I'm pretty sure this is a bean plant. It's just, it knows it needs a structure because it's a vining plant, and it's going out searching for that structure to climb up onto. Obviously, this is time lapse. This is on fast forward, huge time. But it shows that some stems, these modified stems, these tendrils, have sort of the ability to feel as we watch it kind of climbing those supports. And I also, in order to illustrate this, there was this test that some botanists did in order to show this ability to feel, what the scientists called Figmotropism. And so it's called the pea tapping test. And so again, peas are a vining plant, and these scientists, as the peas were growing, they were tapping the peas from one side. And so the peas could feel it and they know that they need to climb up onto something. And so they grew to that one side. And then once it started growing that way, they started tapping it from the other side. And they're like, hey, why are you messing with it? Now they're growing off to the other side. And they just kept on doing it. And just kind of a cool example of, again, I don't see a central nervous system on these plants, but they do seem to have all these abilities that we also have, but just in their own kind of intelligent forms.
Christian, we have a question for you. Jack, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that viney plants that like the climb and stuff, if they don't have anything to climb, will they rather grow leaves or roots? And then if they do have something to climb, will they grow more stems? Or do they grow everything randomly anyway?
I mean, I guess the example I would use is cucumbers are a vining plant. They do have these tendrils. And so when we leave them without a support, then they'll just be low growing species. They'll just grow along. I think they're happier if they get a chance to grow up vertically. But they would be low growing, and if they were to find another stem of a plant, then they would definitely latch onto that, and that can actually be a problem with cucumbers. It's encouraged, especially, I mean, this is in commercial production. If you don't prune some of the tendrils, then they can clamp onto a cucumber and they can start scarring it because the cucumber won't be able to grow. It'll just, I mean, it's only an aesthetic defect, which a home gardener wouldn't care so much. But if you're a market gardener and you're worried that people aren't so keen on those little defects, then you won't be able to sell it as easily. Does that make sense, Jack?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess the other point is, if they don't have anything to grow on, then the leaves themselves would start to shade each other out, and they would make the plant less productive, if I can say it that way. Okay. And I'm going to move on from stems here, but I just wanted to include this. We'll look at in more detail in later classes. Stems is a very generic term for what we're talking about. There are much more specific names for these parts that we will learn, but because it's just the first class, we're going to keep it simple. But we will come back to it because I do think the more specific the names we use, then the more specific our observations of the plants can become, and the more meaningful our observations will become. So we'll move on to leaves. And so to represent leaves, this is probably the second most obvious slide of this presentation. We have like a solar farm here going on, whereas with the stem, we had that tiny little photovoltaic cell. When we talk about leaves, they got a lot of surface area. So we have a whole solar farm here making energy from the sun. And so in order to make these sugars, they're breathing in carbon dioxide out of the air. They're taking up water through their root system, the H2O, and they're using sunlight energy in order to power this chemical reaction, this biochemical reaction, in order to make sugar and in order to make the oxygen that is required for us not to suffocate, which I'm quite thankful for. And we have our little, if you're into chemistry and you want to think about it that way, then you can see our carbon dioxide getting added to the water, plus the energy from the sunlight makes us our sugar and makes us our oxygen. So this is obviously the main function of leaves. But I would also point out, just in the interest of this diversity of plant world, think about a cactus in this scenario. We've already talked about stems, and now we're talking about leaves. And so if you think of a cactus, cactuses don't have leaves. Like, they're almost all stem tissue, which is green, right? But think about a cactus in its context. In the desert, there's so much sunlight, they don't need that extra surface area in order to make the energy they need. You know, they're not shaded out by anything else. And so having leaves would actually be a detriment to them, because you can have actually too much sunlight in some contexts. So I think cactuses are really interesting in that respect, because why put the energy into producing leaves if you're already getting all this, all the energy that you need already? So the next function the leaves serve is gaseous exchange. So in the last slide, we noted that they need carbon dioxide out of the air, and they inhale this through their leaves. And this picture in the bottom, this is a magnified picture. This that I'm circling around right now. Actually, why am I not doing that? Yeah, there we go. This is what is called a stomata. And so you can think of the stomata as being similar to the lungs that we have. This is what they breathe that carbon dioxide in through, and they will breathe out extra water and that waste oxygens that we so dearly need. And again, to bring it back to the cactus, if cactuses had leaves, then they would have more stomata. And the stomata they need to conserve water. So if they had more stomata, then that would mean that they would be exhaling more of that water. So that adaptation of not having leaves is really, really smart for cactuses or cacti. And another function that leaves serve for the plant is actually they're kind of like light receptors for keeping track of the season. And this is something that botanists called photoperiodism. And so if you think about it in terms of the leaf buds for deciduous trees, they have these little sensors somewhere on the leaf buds that if it's March and they feel a series of warmer than average days, then they still know through these leaf buds, through the sensors of light, they can still tell how many hours of daylight there is and how many hours of nighttime there are. And this is a really, really awesome feature for them, because if they get fooled by a couple warm days and produce their leaves, and it's still too early in the spring season, then there could still be a very high likelihood of there being a big snowfall. And so if they leaf out too early, then they are very, very vulnerable to losing a lot of their branches because they can't hold that extra weight from the snow. So they combine this temperature sensing with this ability to track how many days of light. And when both of them add up, then that's when they know when to break their dormancy in the spring. But we can also use this concept of photoperiodism in the garden because there are some plants that are triggered by these long days and short nights. So the 4 examples that I have here is spinach, bok choy, lettuce, and potatoes. And so I have tried a couple times to grow spinach in the middle of the summer, but because they have this photoperiodism where it just tells them that if they have a long day and a short night, then they should start to produce flowers. And in the example of the spinach and the bok choy and the lettuce, that is not a favorable situation for a gardener because we eat them before they go to flower. Once they go to flower, they're not as tasty to us. They're not as palatable. They're harder to harvest. You know, there's all these reasons. So if you want to grow spinach or bok choy here in the Rocky Mountains, then those should be planted very early in the season. Luckily, spinach is really, really cold hardy. Bok choy, pretty hardy to cold temperatures, not quite as much. But basically, if you're thinking of growing spinach or bok choy, those have to be planted early in the season, and they're pretty quick to get to harvesting stage. But once you get into those longer days of the summer, they're gonna bolt too quickly, and there's almost no point of growing.
Christian, how early would you plant your spinach here?
Pretty much as soon as the soil thaws. Like spinach is so tough that, yeah, I have planted it in the last week of March, and I planted all through April, but I would stop planting it in May. So that's kind of the planting kind of window that you have. And then I would let that summer season kind of go, and then I would plant it again in early August because that's when the days are getting shorter again, and they won't. I mean, I kind of think about them being stressed, but it's just the mechanism that they have. They're not really, they can get stressed by the heat as well. They're cold tolerant. But yeah, so I would plant spinach from late March to late April, and then I'd plant it again in early August. And the sweet thing about planting it in early August is that that's enough time. They take around 42 to 49 days to reach the harvesting stage. And if you plant it in early August, then you can harvest in September. And they're very unstressed at that point because it's cooler and the nights are long. And not only can you harvest it once or twice in the fall, but the roots of spinach are so tough that they would actually survive the winter and grow back in the spring again. So yeah, spinach is great for that. Bok choy isn't quite as hardy temperature wise, but you can still get a harvest of bok choy. I'll talk more about that in a future class. I have lettuce listed here, but it's not as prone to bolting the same way as spinach is and bok choy is. And then I have potatoes here. That just means that they're more likely to go to flower. And that doesn't mean you can't grow potatoes in the summer. It just means that when they sense those long days and short nights, they'll produce a flower. And sometimes they'll produce a fruit. And I can talk more about that when we get to crop steering. But but yeah, then there's day neutral plants that just don't really give a crap, you know, how long the days are or how short the nights are. Those are tomatoes and cucumbers. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are the short day and long night flowering plants. And the example here is the poinsettia. And so that is like the reason why that's the Christmas kind of garland. It's always flowering at Christmas because that's the shortest day of the year, or, you know, that's the shortest part of the season. So of course that's triggering its flowering, if that makes sense. Okay, so I talked about how plants can communicate with each other through their root system, but plants can also communicate with each other by emitting volatile organic chemicals from its leaves. This I just mentioned just because it's really cool. Another example of how plants can kind of talk to each other, even though they don't have mouths and ears. There is basically just like this chemical signaling that they can do. And if anybody wanted to, on their own time, check out this film, I think it's about 50 minutes. It's called The Minds of Plants by this videographer. There's one example in that film that there was a drought in, I think it was South Africa, and these herbivores on the savanna, they were running out of food to eat, and the last plant that was hardy enough to survive the drought was this plant called the acacia tree. And so they were surviving on this acacia tree, but after a while, these ranchers started to find that these herbivores were dying and they were getting sick and they couldn't understand what was going on. And they found that the acacia trees, they were adapting. They were already really stressed from the drought themselves, and then they were stressed out by these animals that were eating their leaves. And so they started to produce their own toxins in their leaves in order to repel this threat that they had. And the scientists found that all the trees, like once these herbivores started nibbling on the leaves of an acacia, all the trees downwind would start to make their own toxins in order to repel these herbivores. But the trees that were upwind, that weren't getting this chemical signal, weren't making it. So just a kind of another cool example of how plants are talking to each other, sharing information, and having these really impressive adaptive strategies. So this is the last slide for leaves, and it's not that they're doing this on purpose, but the leaves create shade for the soil of where the roots are growing. And so that shade reduces soil evaporation, which keeps moisture in that soil for longer, which means it gives the plants a longer window to take that moisture up with the nutrients in. So sort of like a side benefit. You don't really think about leaves as doing this, but they are creating more favorable growing conditions for themselves by creating shade on that soil. And also, when there's a large rain event that happens, that vegetation above the soil protects the soil from erosion. These erosion events, the energy of that rain that would pound on the soil and pull it away from the root system. So it's creating better growing conditions for itself in that sense. And then also for deciduous leaves, when they fall from the leaves at the end of or when they fall from the plant at the end of the season, they fall to the surface of the soil. And as that organic matter is getting decomposed, it builds soil, it cycles nutrients, and again, it plays this it plays this role of building soil and protecting the root system and creating better and better growing conditions each time. So I'm going to take a drink of water here. Does anybody have questions about leaves?
Feel free to just mute yourself if you do. Doesn't look like we have any questions here, Christian.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Lou, how am I doing on time?
It's 7:45.
Okay, all right. All right, let's talk about flowers then. We could think of the petals of the flowers as just like a runway for their pollinators. They're just like signaling them, letting them know that game on, come get some nectar and some pollen. And this is, yeah, that's obviously one of the functions that they have. And then the other function that they have is just reciprocity at its finest. So they give away nectar, this sweet, sugary treat to their pollinators, and they make extra pollen, which is a really great source of protein for their pollinating allies, in case you didn't know. And in return for this gift, they get a very valuable gift themselves. The one shortcoming that plants have is that they can't move very far. They have this lack of mobility, and so flowering plants have found this amazing ability to they give this gift of nectar and pollen to these animals that can move really well, and so that overcomes their shortcoming. And obviously flowers are involved in sexual reproduction for plants. And so that is why I have this diagram of meiosis down here, which is the process that it basically just takes the genes that each of the parent the plant parents have, and it's sort of akin to just shuffling the deck and just reordering it. And then it's a game once the two the pollen and the egg meet up. It's kind of like a game of dice. It's a game of probability, and it's just like a reshuffling of these genetic traits, and they'll get expressed in different ways each time by that next generation that becomes the seeds. And so when we have this shuffling of the deck, when we have this meiosis happen, in that process, there's this amazing replication of genes that gets passed down to the next generation. And it's really, really impressive how often that these genes get replicated perfectly, but every once in a while this amazing machinery makes a mistake and you have this mutation that happens. And so we have Wolverine up here indicating that just mutation can happen. Sometimes that mutation isn't going to make any difference for the plant. Sometimes it's going to have a detrimental effect, and then sometimes it's going to have a real cool effect and maybe give that plant an advantage somehow so that it can compete better. And maybe it just gives it a different color. And there's a gardener that is into plant breeding or seed saving, and it notices this cool variation that they've never seen before. And if we start to understand that, then that's the first step in learning about plant breeding and seed selection. And if I'm running out over time, maybe I'll just save this for my my botanical language class. We'll talk more about the basic structures of flowers in a couple classes. Just the idea of keeping this within the acceptable limits. But we're moving on to, unless there's a question about flowers there. Nope. Okay, so the next, after flowers, we would have the production of seeds, and the seeds contain the genetic code that's passed down from parents. And so as we can see with Archie and Eli and Peyton, the physical traits from one generation get passed down to the next, and they are expressed. So that is one of the main roles of seeds, is to take that information from their parents and express them in that next generation. Another really, really important function and the way that seeds behave is that you can think of them as like these capsules of energy. And so for that, we have like this root cellar representing just stored energy. The plant will put a lot of energy into the seeds because that genetic information they're passing down is so important. And the seeds need some time to find the right conditions. And they need some food to get by in the meantime. In order to prove this point, think about pretty much all our main staple crops that we humans rely on as a source of energy are basically just processed seeds, or like we just cook up seeds. And so we eat a lot of wheat in the bread that we bake. We eat a lot of rice, corn, beans, not so much in in North America, but in Africa and Asia, millet and sorghum are very, very important food sources. And so this is just, it's because the parent plant puts so much of that energy into the seeds so that they'll survive. Humans aren't the only ones who have figured out that it's a very, very dense source of energy. And yeah, self-explanatory, right? And so when we're thinking about seeds, we need to think of them as living, breathing time capsules. So they have that energy, they have that genetic code, that information system, and they're just they're waiting to find the conditions that will be most advantageous for them to sprout. But when we look at a seed, it might not look like it's doing much, but you can kind of think about it as a hibernating bear. It is still alive, it is breathing, it's just trying to reserve as much of its energy as it can for when it does sprout. And so as a gardener, when you're not using your seeds, if you buy seeds or if you've saved seeds, you want to keep them in a cool, dry, dark place in order for their metabolism to be running at the lowest level possible, so that when we do sprout them, they'll have as much of that stored energy left over to sprout with lots of vigor and vitality. Sometimes my cursor just disappears and it won't let me. Okay, there we go. And then I also want you to think about seeds as having a certain level of situational awareness, which is actually quite impressive, because again, they don't look like they are doing much, but they do have this awareness of what's going on around them. Luckily, as gardeners, our common garden crops that we grow, they have really predictable, with what we call the days to maturity. We'll share more information about that later. They sprout really, really consistently and really predictably. But when we start to think about sprouting more perennial seeds and more wild seeds, they have this really impressive complex dormancy breaking strategies. And if we think about it from a wild plant's perspective, then think about it from a cultivated plant's perspective first, or a gardener's. We plant our seeds in rows and they all come up at once. And they do that because we've selected over thousands of years, we've selected for this trait to get expressed. And at first we didn't even mean to do it because all these different seeds, when they were more wild, when they were more uncultivated, they would have sprouted at different times. But the ones that sprouted first and consistently were the ones that get harvested and saved. So we pass that genetic trait forward, and through generations and generations of this selection, we created this consistency. But if we shift our thinking to think about a wild parent plant, letting its seeds go into the wild, it would not serve as a smart survival adaptation for all of those seeds to germinate and sprout in the same way. Because what if a slug came along and just mowed down all of those seeds that parent plant put all that energy and all that time into producing? So they sprout a lot more erratically, which from our point of view as gardeners is kind of a pain in the butt. But it's from their point of view, it's a lot smarter. And then think about if a wild parent plant were to drop its seeds, and those seeds, if they didn't have that situational awareness and they just sprouted in the late summer, early fall, then they wouldn't have the right amount of time to grow and get established and get tough enough before those cold winter temperatures came along. So that would be very, very unadvantageous. What's the word? It just wouldn't be smart. So a lot of pretty much all more wild perennial seeds, they need to go through this process of stratification, which is what gardeners do to mimic what the frost thaw cycle is, what they would feel in the outdoors. So stratification is if you have wild or perennial seeds, you would put it in the freezer for a couple weeks and then take them out again for a couple weeks and then put them back in and then take them out. And they can feel that change in temperature so that when eventually you do plant them, you've replicated the winter conditions and they're going to sprout. So it's stuff like that. There's a number of other kind of things like that where we want to kind of, when we deal with more wild seeds or uncultivated seeds, we have to kind of understand that they're used to different circumstances. And this is just like a little diagram, basic structures. We'll talk more about that in a later class. And I'll end up, this is the last slide for this class. I'll end up, I talked about how all of these initial lessons are kind of like loose strings all by themselves, but we're gonna weave them together. And so I'll do just one little weave here at the end. I want you to consider the stomata that would be embedded in the leaves. And as I said, one of their main functions is to breathe out water, extra water that they have. And that water is pulled up through the stems that are in the vascular system, which is housed within the stems. It's pulled all the way up from the root hairs, and the root hairs are absorbing that water. And so at a molecular level, water is attracted to each other. It's kind of like little magnets. It's a polar molecule. So one side is just slightly positive charged and the other side is slightly negative. And so that makes them stick together. And you'll probably have seen this behavior in like a glass of water that's just barely kind of overflowing, but it's not falling off the side. There's like this tiny little meniscus that protrudes at the top. And that's this loose attraction that it has to each other. So you have to understand that as the plant is breathing that water out through the stomata, that's what creates this negative pressure that pulls the water up through the root system. And so all of these different parts are connected to each other in this really cool little relationship. And they're able to get all the water that they need and all the nutrients that they need all the way up to the very, very top, even if it's that General Sherman giant sequoia that I showed. It doesn't use any energy whatsoever to fight all that gravity, all that opposing energy. It gets all of what it needs all the way to the top of the plant without using any energy. And that is how, that's just like a little example of how these lessons fit together. Ta-da.
That was great. Thank you, Christian. I feel like my brain is growing tendrils just looking for more plant knowledge. There was so much in there. That was fabulous. Big
Nice.
takeaway for me was the roots and weeding smarter, not harder. So thanks for that tip.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Christian?
I really just like that cactus example. I think that's really cool. Never thought about that, and not having to have leaves.
Sorry?
Oh, I just really liked the cactus example.
Oh, yeah.
And that the fact that they don't have to have leaves. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's,
But yeah, thank you. It's great.
yeah.
Anybody else? Speak up now. Doesn't look like we have any more questions. So, oh, somebody unmuted.
I did.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say that was great. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Thanks, Mom.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad everybody enjoyed. Well, yeah, some people enjoyed it. Yeah, so we're just layering. Just think about that as just the foundation, and we're just layering and showing more of the relationships, and there'll just be more and more practical lessons that you can apply in your garden as we go.
Great. Anyone else? Molly?
I just wanted to say thank you. It was super interesting, and I look forward to the next sessions.
Okay, thanks, Molly.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Right on. Well, I hope to see everybody back on Wednesday.
And which one is on Wednesday? What's it called, Christian?
So yeah, Wednesday, it's called, like, the technical word for it is phenology, but it's basically just us looking at the different stages of plant development, from it being a seed to all the way up till it going to seed again, basically. And so now that we've looked at the parts of the plants and what they do, we'll look at when they're doing it and kind of elaborate on these strategies and think about how we're going to apply that to a garden.
Sounds great. So thanks everybody for tuning in to our first workshop. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you on Wednesday. Take care, everyone.
Please. Thanks, Lou.